Imagine a festival not of quiet reverence, but of a raw, primal ecstasy. A procession winds through ancient streets, the air thick with the scent of pine and the deafening clang of cymbals. Drums beat a hypnotic, heart-pounding rhythm. Flutes wail a chaotic melody that seems to pull at the very strings of sanity. The crowd surges, caught in a collective fervor that borders on madness. Then you see them, the priests. Their eyes are wide, their hair unbound. They dance, they scream, they whip themselves into a state of divine frenzy. And in the terrifying, unbelievable climax of this devotion, some, in a profound act of ultimate sacrifice, take up sharpened flints and perform an unimaginable act upon themselves. This is not fiction. This is a glimpse into the fierce, uncompromising world of Cybele, the Phrygian mother goddess, and the astonishing rituals that defined her ancient cult. Welcome to Veiled Traditions. Today we journey back to the heart of ancient Anatolia, a land steeped in myth and mystery, in what is now modern-day Turkey. Here, amidst the towering peaks and wild forests, arose a deity unlike any other. She was Cybele, the Magna Mater, the Great Mother. But do not mistake her for a gentle, nurturing figure. She was a primordial force of nature, the goddess of the mountains, of wild animals, of untamed fertility, and of the very earth itself. Her power was immense, her worship fervent, and her rites to the uninitiated were nothing short of shocking. We will trace the origins of this powerful goddess, explore the tragic myth that inspired her most extreme rituals, and follow her cult as it spread from the mountains of Anatolia to the very heart of the Roman Empire. To join us on this exploration of faith at its most extreme, be sure to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Our journey into the past begins now. Cybele's story begins shrouded in the mists of prehistory. Her worship is older than Greece, older than Rome. Her roots run deeper than the oldest trees on her sacred mountains. Long before she had a name, she was the spirit of the mountain itself, the untamed wilderness. The earliest representations of her are often humble, yet powerful. Simple black stones, meteorites believed to have fallen from the heavens, or crude figurines found in archaeological sites across Anatolia, dating back to Neolithic times. These aniconic representations suggest a primeval connection to the earth itself, a goddess who was the land, embodying its violent cycles of death and glorious rebirth. As the Phrygian civilization rose around the 8th century BCE in central Anatolia, Cybele's image began to solidify. She was depicted as a regal, formidable figure, often seated on a throne flanked by two powerful lions, symbols of her absolute dominion over the wild. She wore a mural crown, a crown shaped like the walls of a city, signifying her role as a protector of civilization, even as she embodied the chaos outside its walls. In her hand, she often held a tympanum, a hand drum, which would become a central instrument in her ecstatic, hypnotic rituals. Her iconography spoke of a goddess who was both protector and destroyer, a giver of life and a bringer of divine madness. She was the ultimate paradox, the source of civilization's nourishment and the untamed wilderness that always threatened to reclaim it. But to truly understand the most shocking aspects of her cult, we must understand the tragic myth that served as its foundation. It is the story of her mortal lover, Attis. The myth exists in many forms, but the most famous and influential version is a story of love, jealousy, and terrible regret. Attis was a beautiful young shepherd of Phrygia. Cybele, the great mountain goddess, fell deeply in love with him. She made him her consort and her priest, but on one condition: he must vow to remain eternally faithful to her. Attis, however, was mortal. He fell in love with a river nymph and planned to marry her. When Cybele discovered his betrayal, her divine love turned to an all-consuming rage. On Attis's wedding day, the goddess appeared. She did not strike him down with a lightning bolt. Instead, she inflicted a far more terrible punishment. She struck him with a divine madness, a religious frenzy so powerful it shattered his mind. In his delirious state, Attis fled into the wilderness to the foot of a pine tree. There, overwhelmed by guilt and divine madness, he took a sharp piece of flint and castrated himself, bleeding to death. Where his blood touched the earth, violets sprang forth. Cybele, her rage now replaced by profound grief and remorse, was devastated. She pleaded with the supreme god, Zeus, to bring Attis back to life. Zeus refused, but he granted her a consolation. Attis's body would never decay, his hair would continue to grow, and his little finger would forever move. Attis became an eternal symbol of the dying and resurrecting vegetation god, a symbol of nature's cycle of death in winter and rebirth in spring. But his final, desperate act of self-mutilation would echo through the centuries, becoming the terrifying centerpiece of his goddess's cult. The myth of Attis is the key that unlocks the central mystery of Cybele's worship. It provided the divine blueprint for her most devoted followers, a unique and shocking priesthood known as the Galli. These were not typical religious figures who simply tended a temple. The Galli were eunuch priests, men who had, in a moment of overwhelming religious ecstasy, emulated the self-castration of Attis. This act, known to the Romans as the everatio, was not merely a brutal physical alteration. It was a profound spiritual transformation. It was a definitive, irrevocable break from the mundane world of masculinity, procreation, and ordinary society. It was an act of total surrender to the divine will of the Great Mother. The decision to become a Gallus was not pre-planned like joining a monastery. It was often the spontaneous result of the intense emotional and spiritual intoxication that occurred during Cybele's frenzied festivals. The process itself was a ritualistic act of devotion. At the peak of their ecstatic state, fueled by the relentless drumming and hypnotic music, a devotee would be seized by the divine madness. They would use a sharpened flint, a piece of obsidian, or sometimes even a shard of pottery, the tools of a primitive, pre-civilized age, to perform the act. The blood they shed was not seen as a wound, but as a sacred offering to the Mother Goddess, a potent sacrifice that consecrated the individual to her service for the rest of their lives. Once they became Galli, they adopted a new and distinct identity. They shed their old names and their old lives. They wore elaborate, often brightly colored robes of yellow, purple, and green. They wore heavy jewelry, earrings, and makeup. They grew their hair long and styled it with perfumes and oils. Their appearance was deliberately androgynous, transcending the conventional gender roles of the ancient world. This ambiguity was symbolic. They were no longer men in the traditional sense, but they were not women. They were a third gender, a liminal class of beings who belonged wholly and exclusively to the goddess. Their lives were dedicated to performing Cybele's rituals, maintaining her temples, and acting as her oracles. They often wandered the countryside in groups, begging for sustenance from the communities they passed through. During these processions, they would engage in ecstatic dances, flagellating themselves and prophesying in a state of divinely inspired frenzy. They were figures of both awe and fear, seen as holy men who had direct access to the divine, but also as unsettling figures who existed outside the normal bounds of society. The Galli were most visible, and their rites most intense, during Cybele's grand annual festivals. The most famous of these, particularly after her cult spread, was the Megalesia. This was a multi-day celebration that took place in the spring, commemorating the death and rebirth of Attis, and by extension, the rebirth of the natural world. These festivals involved elaborate public processions, theatrical performances, and private secret rites for initiated members. But at their heart were always the Galli, and their electrifying, sometimes terrifying, public displays of devotion. The processions were a spectacle of sound and fury. The Galli would lead the parade through the streets, carrying the sacred image of Cybele. This was often not a human-like statue, but the black meteorite stone that was believed to be her most ancient and potent manifestation. They would beat their timpani, clash their cymbals, and play their shrill flutes, creating a deafening hypnotic din designed to alter the state of consciousness of both the participants and the spectators. As the music crescendoed, the priests would whip themselves into a frenzy. Their long hair would fly as they spun and danced wildly. They would cut their arms and chests with knives, splattering their blood on the altar, and the crowd as a form of purification and blessing. It was during this peak of religious ecstasy, this divine madness, that a new devotee might be inspired to perform the ultimate act of sacrifice and join the ranks of the Galli. It was a cycle of devotion, written in blood and sacrifice, that renewed the priesthood for centuries. If you are fascinated by the raw power of these ancient rituals, please take a moment to hit the like button. Your support helps us to continue uncovering these incredible hidden stories from our past. The self-castration ritual was the symbolic core of the cult, a shocking act that held multiple layers of meaning. Firstly, and most obviously, it was a direct reenactment of the myth of Attis. By physically becoming like Attis, the Galli ensured the cyclical renewal of nature. Their sacrifice was believed to appease the grief of the goddess and guarantee a fertile harvest and the continuation of life. They were, in essence, taking the grief of the goddess upon themselves to benefit the entire community. Secondly, the act was a symbolic death and rebirth. By shedding their male identity and their ability to procreate, they were reborn into the service of Cybele. They became sacred vessels, immune to the worldly temptations of family and desire, and could therefore dedicate themselves wholly to her. This act of profound renunciation gave them immense spiritual authority. It was a sacrifice so total that it was believed to grant them a special connection to the divine. Thirdly, it was an act of control over the uncontrollable. In a world fraught with disease, war, and the unpredictable whims of nature, this was a self-inflicted, purposeful sacrifice. It was a way of taking the chaos of the world and transforming it into a sacred act of devotion. This extreme nature of their rites both fascinated and appalled the ancient world, particularly the Greeks, and later the Romans, who viewed such practices with a mixture of reverent awe and deep suspicion. Despite, or perhaps because of, the shocking nature of her cult, Cybele's influence began to spread far beyond the borders of Phrygia. She eventually found a permanent and powerful home in the heart of the Roman Empire. Her arrival in Rome in 204 BCE was a momentous event, a strategic move during one of the darkest periods in Roman history. Rome was locked in the bloody Second Punic War against Hannibal of Carthage. After a series of devastating defeats, the Romans were desperate. In their desperation, they consulted the Sibylline books, a collection of prophetic utterances. The prophecy they found declared that the foreign invader could only be expelled from Italy if the Magna Mater, the Great Mother from Ida in Phrygia, was brought to Rome. This was Cybele. The Romans, putting aside their cultural suspicion of foreign gods, sent a prestigious embassy to the city of Pessinus in Anatolia, the center of Cybele's cult. After careful negotiations, the Roman delegation was given the sacred object they sought, the small black meteorite stone, which was believed to be the living embodiment of the goddess herself. The stone was transported to Rome with immense ceremony. Its arrival was hailed as a turning point in the war, and indeed, the tide began to turn in Rome's favor. Hannibal was eventually defeated. Whether by divine intervention or a massive boost in Roman morale, Cybele was given the credit. From that moment on, Cybele, now officially known by her Roman name Magna Mater, became a state-sanctioned deity of Rome. A magnificent temple was built for her on the prestigious Palatine Hill, the very heart of Roman power. The Megalesia festival was officially added to the Roman calendar. The wild goddess from the mountains of Anatolia had conquered the world's greatest empire. However, Rome's acceptance of Cybele came with significant conditions. The Roman state, ever pragmatic and concerned with social order, was deeply disturbed by the barbaric and ecstatic nature of her rites, particularly the practice of self-castration. They attempted to control and Romanize her cult. While they built her a temple and celebrated her festival, they passed a strict law. No Roman citizen was permitted to become a Gallus. The priesthood was to be filled only by men from the east, from her Anatolian homeland. This was a measure to prevent what was seen as an un-Roman and morally dubious practice from infecting the populace. The frenzied, self-mutilating aspects of her worship were considered alien and potentially destabilizing to the stoic, disciplined Roman ideal of masculinity. This created a strange paradox. Cybele was an official goddess of the Roman state, yet her most devoted priests were viewed as foreign outcasts, figures of both fascination and contempt. The Roman citizens could attend the public portions of the Megalesia, watch the theatrical plays, and enjoy the feasts. But the inner mysteries of the cult, the secret rites performed by the Galli, remained separate and shrouded in suspicion. The Galli continued their practices, ministering to the faithful, prophesying, and performing their dramatic rituals. But they always remained outsiders within the very heart of the empire that had adopted their goddess. Despite these restrictions, the cult thrived. It held a powerful appeal, particularly among the lower classes, slaves, and women. It offered an emotional, direct, and ecstatic religious experience that was profoundly different from the formal, contractual nature of traditional Roman state religion. In a world of rigid social hierarchies, the Cult of Cybele offered a space for emotional release and a direct connection to a powerful, divine feminine force. The dramatic story of Attis, his suffering and rebirth, resonated deeply with people who felt powerless in their own lives. The cult of Cybele and her Galli priests persisted for centuries, a constant, vibrant, and controversial presence in the Roman Empire. Even as late as the 4th century CE, when Christianity was on its inexorable rise, the cult of Cybele was one of its most powerful pagan rivals. The early church fathers wrote extensively against her abominable rites, seeing the Galli as a symbol of pagan excess and moral decay. The conflict between the followers of Christ and the followers of Cybele was a clash of worldviews. Eventually, as Christianity became the state religion of the empire, the old pagan cults were suppressed. The temples of Cybele were closed or converted into churches. The public performance of her ecstatic rites was forbidden. The sound of the Galli's drums and cymbals faded from the streets of Rome, and the wild goddess of Anatolia was slowly forced back into the shadows of history. Though her temples now lie in ruins and the Galli have long passed into myth, the echoes of her powerful cult resonate even today. Her image as a potent mother goddess, a bringer of fertility and regeneration, influenced later goddesses and spiritual concepts, and can even be seen in some artistic depictions of the Virgin Mary, who is sometimes shown with lions. The archetype of the dying and resurrecting God, embodied by Attis, is a powerful theme that can be found in countless mythologies, including the story of Christ himself. The story of Cybele reminds us of the incredible diversity and intensity of human religious experience. It speaks to a primal connection with the earth, a recognition of nature's untamed, creative, and destructive power. It reveals the lengths to which individuals would go to achieve a profound, ecstatic union with the divine, sacrificing the very essence of their worldly identity to become one with their goddess. Her wild rites, though deeply disturbing to modern sensibilities, were for her followers a sacred path to transcendence, a way to become one with the great mother of all things. What do you think of this extreme form of devotion? Is there a line between faith and madness? Share your respectful thoughts in the comments below. We believe the greatest stories challenge us to look at the world differently. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the frenzied world of Cybele. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration of the world's most hidden customs, make sure you are subscribed to Veiled Traditions. Until next time, keep searching for the truth that lies behind the veil.